Thank you for downloading this Real Agriculture podcast. Excite your crops with inputs from Excite Bio. Access nitrogen and phosphorus with Excite Bio's lineup of inoculants and ag biologicals. Since 2010, they've been helping farmers harness the power of the soil. Learn more at excitebio.ca. That's XITEBIO.ca.
Thank you to our sponsors, the Soybean School, RealAg shops, and of course, the RealAg newsletters. Don't miss out on any of the content we publish, from agronomy, current events, to industry news. Our daily e-newsletters will bring you the most current pieces every morning straight to your inbox. Visit realagriculture.com/subscribe to get real and get connected with Real Agriculture. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Agronomists. I am your host, Lindsay Smith. Welcome, everyone, of course, joining us from wherever you happen to be right now. In Canada, we've got Kevin's joining us from BC while he's doing the milking. We've got Paul's joining us from the hockey rink. That's dedication, folks. If you're going to listen or watch from wherever you are, we really do appreciate it. Of course, if you do collect those CEU credits, head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomists. Starting tomorrow morning, we've got your form there to fill out. Let us know you watched the show and we'll get those for you. And yeah, great to see Jason here, Ray as well, and Peter Johnson is back in the chat after a busy few weeks of travel. So welcome back here, Peter. We are tonight going to talk about soybeans, soybean planting, and of course getting this crop off to the best start possible. So to have that conversation, I have none other than Horst Bohner. He's the Omafra soybean specialist, and Mike Weir with Corteva out of Miami, Manitoba, which is not as warm as Miami, Florida.
Sunny Miami.
Sunny. How is it there, Mike?
It's white again, but the snow is very quickly disappearing just as fast as it came the last day here. But no, we're not quite as warm as the southern Miami, but it's been unseasonably warm for most of the winter here. So can't complain.
Mm-hmm. But it does make one think of early planting, and that is what we're going to talk about tonight. At least one of the things we're going to talk about. And Horst, of course, you've been on the road. You've been busy speaking at all the conferences. And what are you hearing from farmers this winter? What's top of mind when it comes to soybean production?
Well, Lindsay, not to start on a negative, but one thing that I did notice before Christmas, everybody was coming off a high. Big yields, right? Relatively good prices still. This spring, what I'm hearing is a lot of talk about prices. But, at the end of the day, we have to grow the absolute best crop we can to maximize every acre. But yeah, to be honest with you, that's really what I'm hearing. People are pretty nervous about the dollars and cents. And that comes into play when it, even some establishment stuff, seeding rates and how much fertilizer and all that stuff. But the economics, I think, they're on a lot of people's minds.
Mm-hmm. Mike, are you hearing similar conversations with your growers?
Yeah, very much. We just got through Crop Connect here in Winnipeg, not too long ago, and a lot of conversations with growers there where they're echoing the same comments, where there's still a lot of crop in the bin, growers that wish they had done more off the combine, and they continue to watch those futures go down. So a lot of questions on, how to sharpen the pencil even sharper as far as input costs while still maximizing yields. And, that's kind of where we're at right now.
Mm-hmm. So let's maybe start there. Wasn't where I planned to start, but this show is all about just rolling with it. It's live. And so one of the places, of course, that farmers think about, at least at times, on trying to save some dollars here, some dollars there, are on seed costs and maybe changing plant populations. On that note, Horst, is that a good idea, bad idea?
Well, this is the way I would put it. It really depends on the kind of yield environment you're in, right? And so when I started this job back in 2001, we had one recommendation, and wait for it, this was in 7.5 inches, 250,000 seeds, And we didn't even spell that out. It was all in pounds per acre, right? And that's not that long ago when you think about it. And in 15s, it was 190,000. And by the way, in 20s and 30s, that's the only number we had. So, we've come a long way from there. The only reason I say that is we've come a long way from one number for a whole bunch of row widths and equipment. And the thing that I've really learned is that in a high yield environment where you're really feeding those beans, you can radically reduce the seeding rate. But you cannot do that in a situation where the beans don't get as tall, where they don't have as many nodes, heavier clay. In fact, the opposite is true. In some cases, we should be putting down more seeds. So this whole idea of precision or variable rate seeding, I buy into it. I just wish it was easier to prove in soybeans than for some of the other crops.
Mike, where do you take that conversation on plant populations, on trying to dial that in ahead of time?
Yeah, well, it's not just a conversation we have on a year like this. It's a conversation we have every spring, it feels like. And when we get into the area that I cover, so southern Manitoba, eastern Manitoba, right in the heart of the Red River Valley, where primarily most of the soybeans are grown in Western Canada, it's really about working backwards. So, what do you want to end up with for a final plant stand? And then, like Horst mentioned, what are some of the environments you're going into? Are you in an environment where you can't trim back too far, or you're going to start sacrificing yield? And yield is where you take advantage of those future prices, wherever, if they're lower than you normally think or higher. So generally speaking, we've come through some fairly dry seasons the last 3 years here. So the trend has been tapering off as far as seeding rates. But we really caution growers not to go too far on the wrong side of the spectrum, right? Because we do run into some challenges every spring, whether it's crusting, whether it's cold night or a cold spell. We run into some challenges with moisture to work with, as far as how far do you push down for planting depth. And I'm sure we'll get into that later in the show. But all those things we got to factor into when we're determining how low we go as far as the seeding rate to still achieve an optimum yield, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, Lindsay, just a final thought to put some numbers on it, to give guys some real numbers. Here in Ontario, I would say the lowest I'm comfortable with is 120,000 seeds in a really high yield environment. I would barely ever recommend that, but I'm saying that's the absolute lowest. And more generally, 150 is still a pretty good number, right? In a good, nice, lush soil. And then on heavy clays, yeah, we're still over 200, and it does depend on your row width too. But the other thing I want to just throw out at people, or make them realize, is that if you're going to play with variable rate seeding, you have to change the number between your zones by more than 25,000, because you'll never see any yield difference by such a small change. And so we got to be kind of more courageous when it comes to trying to separate those numbers. Otherwise, you might as well just pick one number, right? And I'll tell you what it is. It's 165 in 15-inch rows, and that's going to cover 90% of how accurate we can get.
So that's a good point. If you're not going to vary it by quite a margin, just don't bother. So now, but Peter throws out there, how low in those high yield areas? So you said 120. Peter threw out 80,000. So you're a no on that one then. But Peter, please try it and let us know how it works.
Well, okay, so I mean, I absolutely am a hard no on that, because when you seed 80, you're not going to end up with 80. You'll end up with 70 or 65, and we know that that's too low in most of Ontario. Maybe there's some pockets around Mitchell's Bay on vegetable ground or whatever, but the majority of us need at least 90,000 plants to kind of get to that upper 90-95% of potential yield, right?
Okay.
So Peter, like usual, he's on the right track, but he's just not right. What can I say?
Yeah, take what you can. You're the one on camera tonight, Horst. Now, Mike, so similar idea, but
Sorry, I
in
maybe
that,
jump in too.
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, like as far as the 80,000, like for us, we look at that as the very bottom from a reseed decision or not in some of the environments we grow soybeans in. So again, we see our range. It started out when we first started growing soybeans, and I see Jason Boat on the group here. I actually was hired as an agronomist. My first summer job was with Jason Boat, so I've learned a lot from him over the years. And but no, I would say we've started out fairly high in that 200,000. We've crept down to that 185 in that 15-inch row spacing. It's a lot of 165 on 30-inch rows, and that's just continuing to trend downwards.
Okay.
At the end of the day, we hope to be kind of in that 140,000 plants per acre to achieve maximum yield. And then we get called out to the fields where we're trying to determine whether we need to reseed or not. And generally our numbers are around that 80,000.
Yeah.
So Lindsay, if we want to
ahead.
throw up a slide here, slide number 4 of mine, it captures my whole thought on this one. The one with the stars. Yeah, perfect,
There
right?
you go. Okay.
So here's the problem. So we seeded 90,000 seeds per acre in 15-inch rows, and then we added a whole bag to get to 230. And you can see in every case, yield increased over, this is the last couple of years at those sites. Surprising. I was actually not expecting such an increase. Now, it's still not enough to pay for all that seed. And of course, you get into lodging. And I'm not saying that's our recommendation, but the numbers are still compelling. To say, for instance, that 90,000 is right at Elora, well, you're giving up 12 bushels. I mean, good night. That's that's just
significant. Yeah.
That's huge in the soybean world, right? So I think that's kind of summarizes that there's differences, but you can't go too low. Look at how much you're giving up, right?
Mm-hmm. Now, Mike, I know this is, and it's one of the things, and I'll give soybean its due for this. I love watching those soybean plants emerge and push with their neighbors to get a crust up and out of the ground and really work together as a team to do that. So Janet says that they planted trials from 60K to 320, no real yield difference, but the advantage with the high numbers is better push through crusty soil. So when you're looking at less than ideal planting conditions, is that an indicator of pushing those plant populations as well, or how do you make that call?
Well, generally speaking, I guess when we start thinking about when we start pushing populations higher, it's all in the row spacing plays into it. I shouldn't say populations, seeding rate higher is when we start looking at using a lot of air drills that are used in Western Canada that can do some more physical damage to seed coats, causing some mortality before that seed's even hit the ground yet. So we bump things up there. If we know we're going into a heavier clay, generally speaking, they are more prone to that top surface compaction. So if that's the case, we will bump things up a little bit more too, depending on how early we are in the spring. And to Janet's point, on a planter, generally speaking, those plants or those seeds do a really good job helping each other out, busting through that crust. When we start getting too low, whether it's on a hoe drill, whether it's on a disc drill, our singulation isn't quite as accurate, or depth isn't quite as accurate, and you start getting a little bit of inconsistency on when things are pushing through. And if you get a crust in that environment, that's where we do start to see things creep down as far as your final plant stand, because you just don't have that helpful neighbor beside you to push through like you would in a nicely singulated, consistent seed depth row that you get with a planter.
Mm-hmm. It's an excellent example of teamwork, making the dream work, you guys. All right, so there are a couple questions that I do want to get to, although we'll certainly go back to some of these, but the question of disease. So I think Paul Hermans had it earlier on how you factor in white mold risk into plant population choice. And Dr. Dave Hooker here is also looking at canopy closure and a few other things too. So we'll come to that one. Let's start with Paul's question though on disease risk, specifically, of course, on white mold. So Horst, what is the going rate that good beans don't get white mold? Right? You've got to have great yield potential to actually have white mold. But if you've got a field with, if you're in an area that gets a lot of white mold and you've got a field with a lot of history of it, would you be making differences to either row spacing or populations?
Yes, absolutely. The white mold is such a virulent and disastrous disease if you've got if you're in one of those areas that consistently gets it, that you basically have to fight it on multiple fronts, right? And that includes variety selection and maybe a little bit less tillage. And there's you plan for fungicides. And one of the things that you can do is really reduce your seeding rate, or more importantly, your population, right? So in that case, yeah, if someone asks me a general recommendation, never 7.5s. 15's okay, but to be honest with you, if to Paul's point out in Eastern Ontario, go with the 30s and seed at 120 or maybe even 110 kind of a number, because that's a really different environment than most of us are dealing with. So yeah, absolutely, go to 30s and crash that population. And yes, you're giving up 4 to 5 bushels in yield potential, but you're saving 15 to 20 maybe on the potential of white mold loss. So that's my
Mhm.
answer to that.
It's awful, guys. It's terrible.
White mold is, oh,
Yeah, when a field gets smoked by white mold here, so I'm in Eastern Ontario, it's it's a sight to see. That's for sure. It hurts a little. Now, Mike, definitely, back in the honeymoon phase of soybeans in Manitoba, there weren't these big disease issues and cyst nematode issues we had to talk about and all that. It was wonderful and everything was perfect. No longer the case. And so, how does the disease question factor into plant populations there, or is it still not the biggest issue necessarily?
No, and I mean, as it refers to white mold, for sure, as agronomists, we talk about the G by E by M interaction, right? So
Right.
genetics by environment by management. It's a perfect example with white mold where we don't have the consistent year to year pressure that the folks to the east, Eastern Canada have, but we do have, every, let's say 3 to 4 years where we get a few areas that have that higher humidity for a prolonged period of time, maybe a little bit cooler, um, where we do see flare ups of white mold. And generally, it's not too yield robbing. We don't have a lot of growers that budget in a fungicide application at R1 for control. So that's where when we talked about variety selection, there's a lot of work that goes into characterizing these varieties in the research programs of each seed company to determine which ones are going to genetically handle white mold pressure better. So we'll make sure if white mold's a concern, that's what we'll focus on from a genetic standpoint. Then the management side of it. If you're in an environment where you get white mold more consistently, we'll watch that plant population. And then the row spacing too. Generally, we'll try to widen things up to get a little bit more air movement through that canopy to reduce that risk. But our biggest threat from a disease standpoint is probably the seedling disease complexes and some of those other ones that rear their ugly head later on in the season, like phytophthora root rot, especially in the clays in the Red River Valley. If we do get into some wet cycles, that's one that we get a lot of questions on. With that too, variety selection is key, and if we are in an environment where we are going to have ponding and just wet conditions, that's where we'll play around with maybe going a little bit higher as far as plant populations, just to account for some of the losses you might see throughout the year.
Mm-hmm.
And one thought that comes to mind, Lindsay, I think sometimes we talk so much about a specific disease that we start to think we need to manage for it. For most of Ontario, ignore the whole white mold conversation. Just forget about it. You're going for high yield. White mold does not, you don't get a field that has zero white mold to a disaster. It builds up over years. So those guys in Eastern Ontario and places that know they have it, absolutely, you fight that with everything you can. But for the rest of us, personally, in my plots, I couldn't care less about white mold. It's just a non-issue, right? And so I think that's important to throw in here. Go for the high yield, choose those varieties, ignore that whole conversation on white mold unless you are sadly in an area or in fields that consistently gets it. That's my point, right?
Mhm.
Well, it's a great point to make. Like when I'll echo that for the West. Generally, if we see white mold in our soybean crop, it generally means the conditions have been very good for high yields.
Exactly.
We
Yeah.
generally don't see wrecks on white mold unless you're kind of in those secluded areas along, bush lines or riverbeds or river runs. But generally, we don't see that consistent corner to corner infestation of white mold.
Yeah.
And if we do see some of it scattered throughout the field, generally growers are excited to get in there with the combine to see what they have for a yield.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It doesn't look nice, but it probably means there's some bushels there. And I will say, you mentioned the tree line. I went out and took some pictures this past fall. There was just right along the tree line, it was just brown, sad, and the rest of the field looked fantastic. So yeah, that's just how it goes sometimes. Okay, we're gonna just hop quickly here. We're gonna play our first clip and hear from our show sponsors. But Producer Jay, if you would, I want to talk about, because this is a video that did very well, Horst, talking about a little tillage versus no tillage versus lots of tillage, but really how a little tillage might be better than none. And oh my gosh, it got people talking. So Producer Jay, if you would, let's run the clip.
Why have you gone down this road of twin rows?
Well, we struggle with residue, and now corn yields are even higher.
Right.
Once you get over 200 bushel corn yields, you've got a lot of residue to deal with.
Right.
And my experience with no-till over the years has been the further I can be away from the residue, the better my stand's going to be. And we like to plant soybeans inside those both rows and no depth wheels on the corn stalks, so that it's got a nice clear track. So we have a planter converted to 7.5-inch spacing, twin rows, and so we had to do some modifications. There's a special tongue on it. Everything had to be shifted, but other than that, it's pretty well stock. And 7.5-inch rows right between the rows. We use RTK for guidance, so we can run pretty well right down the center all the time. And we have had essentially no problems with stands since. And our depth is consistent because we're not running on the stalks or root balls.
And that's straight no-till. You're not doing any pre-tillage there?
Straight no-till and corn stalks.
Okay.
Straight no-till.
And so when you're seeding those beans in the spring, then you're able to, because of the RTK, stay right off the corn rows, and you feel that is really what's helping you out in terms of keeping with true no-till. Because we still have guys, that are getting 250 bushel corn now, right? And they say, I just can't do it anymore with all this residue. Right. But what's really interesting in this field is that now we're close to harvest. There's not a lot of residue left here when you look down the row, eh?
Not too much. Enough to know that it was a corn crop.
Yeah, but that's about it.
That's about it.
It's kind of disappeared largely.
That was a good yielding corn, and last year you would have looked like there was residue everywhere, but we find all the small residue, the small stems, all that by spring is almost irrelevant. And the only thing we're worried about is the coarse stem at the ground and the root balls. And we're not playing with them. We just leave them. And we roll it after. It knocks them down. And we have no problem at harvest. And it's the simplest route we've been able to get to for soybeans that give us a consistent good yield.
Our sponsors for the Agronomists are RealAg Shops, the newsletters, and the Soybean School. The Soybean School on Real Agriculture is an agronomy video series that allows soybean growers to learn on their own time and at their own pace in order to become better growers in the long term. The Soybean School is made possible by support from Syngenta Canada and BASF. So that is Rob Templeman in that clip. It has, if anyone has gone to the Soybean School and checked out that video, it's that's just a teeny piece of it. There's just gold nuggets in there. I got to tell you, Horst, it's a really good one, and so I highly recommend going and check it out. But some really key thoughts there. So, and that's where I want to talk about is on that either tillage no tillage on that seedbed prep. The key there, I think that Rob really touches on, is that if so long as they can avoid the root ball and that the base of that corn stalk, they're drive on. They're good to go. But that's not, of course, always the case. But Horst, is that what really farmers need to be targeting with exactly that, those really big corn yields that come off and leave a ton of residue behind?
Well, it's the way I look at it from a soybean perspective. Tillage, in and of itself, unless you have a compaction problem, and a lot of us don't, it doesn't actually help soybeans much. It gets you a little more in terms of plants per acre because the ground is a little warmer. It helps, Mike's point about some of those early seedling diseases. You have a little bit less of that. And we actually have some proof that you need a little lower seeding rate with tillage. But here's my point. If you can just push the residue out of the seed row from a soybean perspective, you're fine. So here's the conundrum. How do you do that without going to 30-inch rows? Because in 15s, you just push it into the next. There's not enough room. Right. There's too much junk. So what we just saw there, what the Templemans are doing is they're pushing enough back onto the old corn rows to do twins. And here's my point. Then you've got the highest yield potential that exists for soybeans in terms of row spacing, because it's equivalent to 15s or 7.5s. So but the problem with that scenario is, it's hard to talk people into twin rows. I mean, they kind of roll their eyes and they say, come on, like, I'm not going to buy another planter, or they're too heavy. They have their own problems, right? And so that's why we still kind of, as an industry, one of the main questions I've had for over 20 years now, 23 years, to be honest with you, every week I have this conversation with somebody, is what kind of planter do I buy to do everything? And that's where it gets hard, right?
Mm-hmm. That's when you tell your neighbor to buy a different one and then you switch. I know.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, exactly. I live in a very strange world. But hey, if you could make it work, make it work. Oh. All right. Yeah. So Mike, similar question on, ahead of beans, what are farmers typically doing, or what solution are they trying to figure out if they're using tillage?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag, because we deal with growers on the Mississippi sands, and you go 5 miles one direction, you're in some pretty heavy clays. So it varies by soil type and how forgiving that can be. In some areas, there's a lot of growers that try to do a little bit of fall work. So in the heavier clays, do as much as they can in the fall. And then that way they don't touch it in the spring to avoid some of that compaction and some of those issues there. For the most part, like we probably have a few more crops in our rotation, and it varies on fall tillage or spring tillage, depending on which previous crop you had before you're going in there with your soybeans. So I would say that there's a mixture of minimum till or no till. I think the percentage is lower of conventional till in the drier trend that we've had in the last, let's say 3 years. Growers aren't going out and recreationally tilling anymore. They're wanting to conserve as much moisture as they can, and they're seeing the value in that when it comes planting time in the spring. So the only time they'll go out and do a tillage application is when the seed bed just isn't fit to do a good job at planting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think
go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think for us, maybe, and I could be wrong on this, but my gut feel is if prices stay the way they are, we're going to see less of we're going to have less of the conversation around doing more and more tillage just because of the cost, right? So what I've always tried to suggest is that the least amount of tillage is the answer for soybeans to get a good stand and to deal with the residue. So what works for me, and I think a lot of guys have gone down some version of this, is a vertical tillage tool just once in the spring. It levels things out. It makes the planter or the drill perform better. It makes the header perform better. Is it, 5 bushels more? Absolutely not. It's maybe a couple bushels more. And sometimes it helps us with a better even plant stand, but that's how people are trying to get around it. And when I say that 2 bushels on average, that's the average number. What really hurts though is sometimes when you lose 4 or 5 bushels to true no-till, and that's what people remember. But my whole point is, I don't think we're all going back to the moldboard plow. That is not we're not going there, just for a whole bunch of reasons. But on the other hand, I kind of push back when people say no-till is the answer. It's not the answer, because if you go to places like Argentina, they went to no-till, all no-till, and you know what? It created a whole raft of new problems. So if you think no-till is the world solution to the problems we have, you need to travel more, because it's not it, right? It creates a whole set of its own problems. So we're trying to find that middle ground.
No-till is an answer, not the answer. Just like strategic tillage, which is the term I like to use on the show. Strategic tillage is an answer, maybe
Right.
not the answer, right? So yes. Although, Mike, it is good to hear. I mean, I'm from Southern Manitoba as well. Definitely in those wetter years, you'll see the cultivators come out a little more ground being worked. But we know that if moisture is limiting, we really can't work that soil any extra time, or we just give it away.
Well, if it's too wet in that clay, you're creating some problems. If it's too dry, the sand dries out, and the clay, it's amazing how fast it'll dry out too in some of our spring conditions. So I think a lot of growers that are following corn with soybeans, there's some pretty aggressive tillage that goes on in the fall if the season allows it. Try to bury as much of that residue as possible. But then there's a growing number. It's not a big number, but a growing number of growers that are trying some strip till and trying things like that.
Yep.
And then the other thing that growers are utilizing, depending what they're investing in for plant or infrastructure, is trash whips. So they feel like they can maybe get a little bit more aggressive, or I should say, not as aggressive in tillage. And if they're dealing with more residue, they can be more aggressive with their trash whips if they need to be. But then the balancing after that is making sure you're going out there and squashing those trash berms down, so it doesn't create some issues when you're trying to flex them off.
Absolutely. Okay, we've got some good questions that have come in on the fertility side. So that's on my list, but we can take that several different ways. But one that does come up often is starter N or no. And so Mark Davis asks, what about a tickle of N? Which I don't think I've ever heard a tickle of N. So I'd love to know what I've heard tickle tillage. I've never heard a tickle of N. At planting to get the crop canopied quicker on heavy clay, say 30 to 40 pounds actual N. Horst, what say you?
Yeah. So literally for 20 years, we've been chasing nitrogen. Like I honestly have about 170 trials where we've tried N, because it is so intuitive when you are standing there and you've done the trial and the beans close faster, they look prettier. You kind of go, this has to be right. Right? From just
What?
being there, it has to
Yeah.
be right. And then you bring the combine in and you go, again, I am disappointed, right? And so that's the problem. So all I can really do is give you the bushels per acre, and then you got to make up your own mind. And the number is less than 2 bushels, right? On average, to such a small amount. Even on heavy clays. Now there's nuance there. Depending on the exact situation, it might be a little more, but it's almost never 4 bushels. Almost never. And so, again, you're back into, well, why spend your money? Just accept what it is, right?
Mike, any thoughts there? I know that, we've certainly had discussions on rescue treatments of N if nodulation's not going well. There's been discussions on that as well. But have you done any work as well on any sort of early N in soybeans?
I wouldn't say any replicated work where we've looked at trying, like to the point that Horst has worked on for for adding nitrogen for an increase in yield. But there's been a pile of work done with our research group within Corteva or Pioneer, south of the border, looking at what the whole philosophy around a yield pyramid, really building that base foundation, and where do you put your dollars, especially in the environment that we just talked about from a commodity standpoint. Where do you put those dollars when you sharpen your pencil? And you're not maybe getting that return on investment that you'd like to see with the nitrogen component, but maybe it is looking more at your soil test. What's your background level of potassium? What's your background level of phosphorus, sulfur? There's been a lot of recent work done on sulfur showing some promising things. Soybeans are very good at scavenging for nutrients, but we grow other crops in our rotation. And what's the implications on mining our soil if we're not replenishing it with some of these other nutrients? And to me, I think if you have a budget for fertilizer or nutrients, I would put more of that money into the baskets of potassium, phosphorus, and then if you want to play around with some things, maybe it's looking at sulfur.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, Mike, you hit the nail on the head there. If you're going to play with, and I'm totally convinced of this, if you're going to play with nitrogen, you have to use something that has some sulfur in it, right? Ammonium sulfate or some other, because we are seeing these little glimpses of hope on the sulfur side on certain soil types. And if you want to look at that last slide picture, I mean, that should be enough to make anybody wake up on sand soils. This is from a Mazex plot. I've showed this around the countryside, and you can see the center there, how good those beans look compared to the top left and right hand corner. Boy, 11 bushels more to 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate, and that is again on sand soil. Now we have a whole bunch of trials, right, on different soil types, but Mike, to your point, there are some glimmers of hope in terms of sulfur, that story making sense for some of us. And I personally, to be honest with you, to get 11 bushels on any single nutrient in soybeans in Ontario is very hard to do. So these numbers they're awesome, right?
Now this is, again, it's on sand soil, right, Horst? You don't see this kind of result on, say, clay necessarily, or
or loamy soils. We haven't seen it, or decent organic matter. But you know what? I was talking to a really good farmer, Ken Nixon, and he farms over there towards London with his brother as well. And he was telling me, and they showed me some pictures of some lower organic content soil, and they also had a nice response to sulfur last year. Not these kind of numbers, but really promising. Okay. And the neat part is, Lindsay, previously, like they're smart guys. They keep trying this stuff, and they've never seen a real response before, and they're going to try it again on targeted fields, right? And if a guy like Ken Nixon says, "Oh, we got to check this out," I'm awake.
You're going to listen. Yeah,
I'm
there
awake.
you go.
Yep.
Now, our comments are coming in very much, gentlemen. You're hitting the nail on the head. If you're looking at your nutrient budget, nitrogen probably isn't where you spend the extra dollars. Dr. Dave Hooker said maybe you spend it on the higher seeding rate for the quicker canopy, or Warren notes maybe on the potash, which Mike, you mentioned as well, or phosphorus, depending on the soil test, says Peter. Now, Peter just did ask, does the story change on starter N as you move north? More northern growers in Ontario feel they get bigger bang from N. I have to wonder about the field history, Peter, and the inoculating, because I know in Manitoba, Mike, especially back in the day when soybeans first started, actually making sure you've got your inoculant and maybe double inoculant was pretty important. Horst, any comment on the northern growers? And I do love it that you guys call it north, when really to me it's east of Winnipeg. But anyway, we'll call
relative,
it north.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it's all relative, but that's fine. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think Peter is onto something, and all I can really say is that we need more data. I really tried to base my opinions on data. I know people probably listen to me and think, what a grumpy old man. He has an opinion on everything. I don't actually, and I really try to base it base my opinions on data. So I'm going to suggest that we need to do some more trials further north. I would be really surprised, though, if it was more than 2-3 bushel response. It's not going to be 5, I promise you. There's no chance. So we're in that picture somewhere, like we're in that range somewhere. I promise you that's how it'll turn out.
Yeah. All right, Mike, I do want to ask about inoculants. So where are we at on the inoculant front?
Yeah, and I will comment before I move on to inoculants. We've had some growers. Again, I mentioned this isn't replicated trials, but growers that have maybe seeded into fields where they've applied nitrogen. We have had some years going into some high residual N environments as well, versus ones that weren't quite as high residual. And we just really haven't seen that correlation to a higher yield. We get, as Horst mentioned, that nicer looking plant. And maybe that's where you might see the benefit going to a northern climate where you can build a nice vegetative plant quicker in our shortened growing season. We talk about that 95% light interception by R1. Maybe that allows us a better chance of doing that before those soybeans really get nodulating and fixing their own nitrogen. They're supplemented with some of that applied nitrogen. So again, it definitely sparks the interest in doing more work on it, and again, more replicated environment. As far as inoculants go, we're out of the honeymoon stage with soybeans, but that was the initial upfront cost that when we got into soybeans. One of our higher input costs was the inoculants, with a lot of 1x rate liquid on the seed, and then generally, if we're using drills or implements that could accommodate granular inoculant was quite popular too when we first got into growing soybeans, and that was all around going on virgin ground where we didn't have a lot of background rhizobia to accommodate that. But we're not quite as seasoned soybean growers as maybe in the east part of the country, but we've been growing beans for quite some time now. Multiple crops of soybean crops in the rotation, where we are starting to build that background of rhizobia bacteria in the soil. Now they're not going to be quite as energetic as the one you apply on the seed, but at least they're still there. So the trend that we're seeing is through a lot of work that the pulse growers have done locally in our province, there's a bit of a checklist that we can now follow, where if you have soybeans in the rotation so many times in the last given years, if you've had successful nodulation in those years, all those things that you can start checking off. We're now looking at growers that are starting to trim that second rate of inoculant off, maybe going to a 1x rate on seed. And that's kind of where we're at here right now. So we are getting closer to, what folks are possibly doing south of the border, south of us, or even in Eastern Canada. But we are starting to reduce our input costs as far as the inoculant that we're applying on our soybeans.
Okay, that's very cool. Amazing how time flies, and it's been as long as it has for Manitoba. Definitely a new-ish crop anyway, or has been. Okay, so there's some great discussion or some good questions about weed control, and I do want to get to them. But first, Producer Jay, if you would, let's go to our last sponsor, Reed, and gives us a bit of time for the last part of the show here to talk a bit about row spacing and weed control and that as well. So we'll go to the clip, to the Reed. Our sponsors for the Agronomists are the RealAg newsletters, the Soybean School, and RealAg Shops. RealAg Shops is a video series brought to you by Princess Auto. In this series, check out smart and slick shops from across Canada. And if you know someone who has a great shop, nominate them for a tour by emailing shaney@realagriculture.com. All right, so let's talk weed control. So we got a couple questions coming in, and there's a few different things to talk on this point. But Gord Specksnyder asks, the weed spectrum is changing. Should we be shifting to narrow rows for quicker canopy? So Horst, I'll start with you, as Gord is in Ontario, but Mike will cover this question from Manitoba angle as well.
Well, it's a fair comment, right? There's no doubt that if you have 30-inch rows, you're going to be fighting more weeds longer. That canopy closure helps. Now, the difference between 7.5 and 15s is real. It's about 6-7 days difference, if memory serves me right, in terms of the canopy closure. So in those days, that can make a difference for sure. So the tricky part about weeds, of course, as we all know, is you have to know what species and what population you're talking about in terms of what you're fighting with. Like, some growers have done such a good job over the years with their rotation and really on top of weeds. Boy, I tell you, I don't think it makes any difference whether they're 15s or 20s. Weeds are not their main thing. And then we all know those fields where you know what I'm trying to say. Like, weeds is their
I've seen
number
them.
one job.
Yes.
And in that case, yeah, of course, if you use 7.5 inch spacing in that will help you a little bit. Yep, that is
Yep.
a fact. Now, is it enough to actually prevent a second pass of Roundup? Yes, it can be. It can be for
Okay.
sure.
Yep. So now, Dave Hooker says canopy closure by R1, R2 should be the overall goal. Mike, you mentioned that as well, about that goal of wanting to have that light interception, that 95% by R1. So what role does the weed spectrum really play in deciding on plant population? Is that a factor in choosing row spacing or plant pops?
Yeah, I think so for a number of reasons. I think, from a Western Canadian perspective, and specifically, I'll focus in on Manitoba, where some of our trouble weeds, and a big one that's caught the spotlight is kochia populations, where it does really well in stress environments where other crops don't do well. And I think that's where the population on soybeans can help, whether it's a higher population or preferably that narrow row, to try to outcompete any flushes of kochia that you do have coming. So for sure, plant population plays a big role in that. One thing we're really trying to encourage is, and I think everyone in the East, or not everyone, but the majority of folks in the East and south of us in the States, is using those multiple modes of action. As you mentioned, Lindsay, we're not in the honeymoon, or we're out of the honeymoon stage with soybeans. We have a population of some really tough to control weeds that are moving its way throughout Manitoba quite quickly, where we can't rely on just one application of, say, glyphosate, or two applications of glyphosate. We got to start layering with the different tools that we have. So I know I did have that slide that I'd sent you earlier, Lindsay, that came from my colleague in North Dakota, Christy Sundin. And, as far as what they're doing to combat a weed, like I mentioned, like kochia, and a big thing that they're trying to utilize, so this is more the row width in soybean, but they're just trying to utilize that layered approach for pre-emerge to go after kochia populations. So
We'll go
anything
back
we
to
can
that
do.
depth one in a second. Sorry, we'll get to your slide. There we go. And then we'll go back
Yeah,
to the
so
depth one in a minute, but here we go. Yeah.
Yeah, so a picture speaks 1,000 words, right? And this shows where the sprayer missed on a pre. Now look at the competition that took away from just doing a pre to get that crop established, so it can start to canopy over and outcompete some of these troubling weeds. So population plays a key role in combating these tough weeds, but it's not just that. It's these other things that we have to do, like layering our actives that we can use with our in crop or our pre application.
Mm-hmm. That's a significant little triangle there, Mike.
Wow, that's an excellent picture, Mike. That is a beautiful demonstration. Boy, that if that doesn't tell you something, right? That's beautiful. Yep.
Also, Horst, you'll note how many obstacles are in the way of that field of getting it done. There are none. There's zero. That's
point.
what happens. Yeah, exactly. Now, this is so good point, and Horst, as you mentioned as well. So Mike, you've mentioned the layering and following the sequence as you're supposed to, and doing some of the other things in the non-soybean years to try and get ahead of these weeds. But I've seen the pictures too, Horst, of where it's more fleabane than soybeans in some of these fields. What role are we seeing our Extendamax and our Enlist systems, our other herbicide systems in getting ahead of some of these weed problems, especially with our resistance issues?
Well, I think that the good thing is that there is enough experience now to know that we can control them. If, some of these harder and even resistant weeds, with the whole package of approaches. And Mike Cobra has done a nice job in explaining those to us, and Peter Sikkema did some excellent work long term trying to reduce the overall seed bank. So I think it deserves a whole session in and of itself, to be honest with
Absolutely.
you. But
Yep.
my quick take on it would be that, hey, if you've got a problem, we know as an industry how to fight that. We might not be able to perfectly clean it up, but please don't leave it. Get on the phone, figure it out, right? Do not let that get ahead of you, because we do have help for you on that side of things, right? And the reason I'm just hyping that up a little bit is because we both, or all of us, know is that if you let the beans emerge, sometimes there's no answer anymore. Like, you got to do this
Yep.
early on, right?
Yep. And we've got, I love this, the multiple modes of action. We have to think about the modes of action of the herbicides we're using, but that those cultural controls and cultural
Yes.
management decisions
Yep.
are as effective potentially as adding a layer of a herbicide with an effective mode of action. So definitely it's the whole package, whole discussion, which I love, and definitely a good one. Now, we didn't talk a lot about depth. But I do want to touch on it. And then I'm going to ask you both on how early is too early, because that is, of course, where we're going to leave it, because it
Of
is
course.
late February and we're looking at
Uh,
15 degrees in the forecast.
it's the 26th of February. Well, of course, we're going to talk about
Yes,
planting
of course we
soybeans.
are.
Of course, yes, of
Yeah,
course we
of course we are. But the first, let's talk depth. And Mike, you've got one slide. I think it was producer Jay. I think it might have been the third slide, if we want to bring that up. But what's your go-to on that depth discussion? Sorry, it's on Mike's slides there, producer Jay. There we go. Do you go to moisture if it's dry, even if that's 3 inches down? What say you? And then Horst, you'll get your turn. Don't you worry.
Yeah, well, I think there's enough agronomists on this call to know that the typical answer from agronomists is it depends.
That's right.
So
That is correct.
I think again, great work that's been done by the pulse growers out of Manitoba. You look at a lot of sources of information, whether for us it's NDSU or some other folks within our own network. What's that range that you play with for planting depth? And for us, we're trying to target that inch to inch and a half and feel comfortable in doing that. As long as we're in good, consistent moisture. And some of the springs we've had, and don't have to go back too far, inch and a half, and you weren't anywhere near moisture yet. So that's when the phone starts ringing on how deep do I go, and it depends. What's your soil temperature? What's the date in the calendar? What's the forecast? Is there rain in the forecast, or do you have to take advantage of that moisture before it's even lower in subsoil, right? So we did see some growers go as deep as 2.5 inches, and in that case, you're going to have to sacrifice the bad for the good. So maybe bumping up your plant population or your seeding rate to accommodate for that. Depending on the calendar date and the soil temp, it's thrown on a fungicide seed treatment, because those beans are going to have a little bit more time in the ground before they start pushing through. And but ideally, yeah, we're shooting for that inch and a half. For me, I feel really comfortable at that inch and a quarter is a pretty nice sweet spot, and the data supports that.
Horst, does that change for Ontario?
No, right on, Mike. We did the same work, and our results were equivalent, right? An inch to an inch and a half. We even did it across different dates, and the right depth to target was always an inch and a half, April, May, or June. And then, of course, Mike, you brought up the issue of the date, and that's absolutely right. The other one I think is just really those clay soils, right? If you push it below 2 inches in Ontario on heavy clays, we have a hard time getting those beans out. So as a general rule, we cap it at 2. But on loamy soils, yeah, you can go a bit deeper for sure, and they'll still come out. At the end of the day, we probably make too much of it, one way or the other. And this is what I mean. In Ontario, even though moisture is often, not often, is sometimes limiting in the spring, 9 out of 10 times we have more than enough moisture anyway to get them out of the ground. Just weld the thing at an inch and a half and be happy with it.
That's
Honestly,
Ontario. Yeah, that's Ontario, everybody. We cannot say the same for the West.
just
But we
weld
can
it, weld it
certainly,
shut it.
yeah, weld it and go. You heard it here first, folks. Okay, so that brings up though, and yes, we could do an entire thing just looking at the research on dates. But we do have some really great work out of Manitoba, out of Ontario as well, as how early is too early, how late is too late. And so this does bring up the question. And Warren, I have to say, hats off to you for mentioning that last year, April 15th was too early. He did go out and he did put some beans in, and hats off to you for giving it a whirl, for trying it out. I know, yes, it's February. It's silly to talk about, no, we're not going out right now and going to put beans out. But Horst, it's been a mild winter. Some people's oats didn't die. It's very warm. The forecast looks good. Is April 1st too early? As Warren says, maybe April 15th was too early, but I don't want to go by the calendar. But there's a lot of winter left, but it feels early. So
Well,
what is
you're
too early?
no, you hit down the nail on the head. It feels like spring out there. I mean, the birds are chirping, and it feels like, and the tiles are not running anymore, or barely. Like the snow is essentially gone here. It feels like spring. It's going to 15. It's not spring. We're not planting
Right.
soybeans. We're not planting them on the 1st of April. That's too early.
Okay.
We're not even going to plant them on the 10th of April. That's still too
Okay.
early. I've done all that. And we've even planted March 25th. Guess what? Wrong.
Still too early?
There's
Okay.
zero advantage to doing that, and there's
Okay.
always a much higher risk. So you got to wait until the middle of April. Now, if the weather is if April is 25 degrees every day and the ground is fit, let's have the discussion again. But the
Okay.
likelihood of that, I'm guessing, is not.
Hmm.
Right?
Okay.
Usually,
I
usually
I
it
will
changes.
put it in my calendar
Yeah.
that if on late April, if it's this
Well,
nice and
even
the
early
forecast looks
April.
good, we'll have this.
I
Okay?
think if on April 3rd, the
Okay.
next 3 weeks look good, we really do as an
Okay.
industry need to have a discussion as to whether we should encourage some acres to go in, because it is a valid
Okay.
question. Right now, my answer is absolutely not
Absolutely
until the
not.
middle of April.
Okay.
It's just not worth the risk. There's no
Okay.
benefit, only
Now
downside.
now Mike, usually the question is in Manitoba, or it used to be anyway, is how late can I wait for the snow to leave the tree lines and still put soybeans in? And I know that I helped on one of those trials, and it was May 11th, and there was still snow on the tree lines, and the beans went in, and they did just fine, by the way. So it's usually the opposite question, but what is the ideal window? The first 3 weeks of May? Is that still the rule of thumb?
Well, I think we've learned we didn't give soybeans enough credit for their early season vigor and what they can tolerate. So, in the past we've seen growers put in their cereals, they put in their corn, and then they go to canola, and then the last thing they would do is their soybeans or their sunflowers and edible beans, and
Yep.
that's changed. We're focused much on our cereals, getting our corn crop in, then it's right into beans. Guys are holding off on canola uh, because soybeans can handle those tougher spring conditions we have, I think, a little bit better than we gave them credit for initially. And canola, we really need to get that seed out of the ground. To me, it's a bit of a Cinderella crop to put it bluntly, right? Like you gotta get it in the ground and out of the ground as quick as possible to utilize seed treatments and whatnot. So, for us, if we can get our beans in by the third week in May, there's still really good yield potential. But if the conditions are fit at the beginning of May, all the points that Horst made on soil temperature, moisture conditions, if you're checking all those boxes, you talk to a lot of folks. What's one way I can start bumping my soybean yields up? It's by trying to get your beans in a little bit earlier.
Okay. So, and definitely we've had this conversation, and I know Jason votes in the chat, and we've had this conversation even about the flea beetle issue. Should canola be going in later? And if soybeans can handle it, maybe they are the crop that should go in before canola goes in the ground, because canola can also do fine planted into May. So it's a question, definitely.
Yeah, we don't want to be. I mean, we can be reckless. We don't want to go too far the wrong way, right? So it's making sure you're using the right. If you're going early, it's a little bit cooler. There's tools we can use as far as fungicide seed treatments to cover you on the seedling disease complexes. And but yes, I think we can maybe trend on the earlier side than we historically have in Western Canada.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Lindsay, I do feel like, sorry, I do feel some responsibility here being an OMAFRA employee. Yes. There are Agricor implications, right?
That's right. There are dates.
There are dates, and I think we need to at least keep that in the back of our mind as this discussion comes up, right?
Well done, Horst. You get a gold star.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. That is very true. And Peter, and I think Dave brought this up earlier. Really, is it about the soybean yield, or is it getting these beans grown and off so you can get the winter wheat in on time? That's really what this is always about, right? Is just to get the winter wheat in. I'm pretty sure. And Mike just shakes his head. No, it is not. Anyway, that's somewhat tongue-in-cheek.
Okay. Now listen, though, I do think. I mean, I sound angry, but that's because I am a little bit angry, because winter wheat always comes up, and the point that's being made is actually very good. If you plant your soybeans earlier, they are earlier to harvest in the fall, and that is one of the benefits that we haven't hit on. So there is that to keep them on the early side. But again, the problem is, how early, and trust me, April 15th is plenty early on the extreme ultra early end. So that's why I sound a little silly, but there is that truth. Like if you plant April 20th compared to May 20th, that will make a significant difference in the fall, and that might just be the window for winter wheat. And there you go, right?
Mm-hmm. There you go. Mike's not worried about winter wheat, but he doesn't have Peter Johnson.
He's a lucky man out there. He's got it made out there. He doesn't have to worry about winter wheat. Wow.
We still have some winter wheat growers out our way. We have some fall rye growers as well, and even the odd fall rye seed that goes into the ground following beans for some erosion control. But some of those stands sometimes surprise you come springtime.
Yeah.
Rye is a different beast entirely. But yes, absolutely. Okay, we have to leave it there. We're out of time. This has been a lot of fun, a lot of learning. We covered quite a bit, but to both of you, we could probably go another hour. There's lots more to talk about. So don't worry, we'll be doing more agronomists on soybeans as the spring slowly starts, even if it does feel a little early. But Mike, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a lot of fun.
All right. And Horst, thank you, of course.
And Lindsay, you do an excellent job. Beautiful show again. And Mike, it's been fun to get to know you a bit, and to everybody listening, we really appreciate your support. Good luck this spring. It'll be awesome.
Right. And you heard it here. If it is delightful on April 3rd. Horst is coming back, and he's gonna walk us through planting those beans in early April. There you go. All right, thank you everyone for joining us here on The Agronomist. We'll be back next week. We're going to talk about soil health and soil health assessments next week. So check that out, 8 p.m. Eastern, of course, right here. You can find us also, realagriculture.com/agronomist. You can find all our back episodes there as well. And until next week, cheers, everybody.